Hello, my name is Daniel Hampel. Today I'm going to be talking about the conflict between China and the Philippines at the Second Thomas Shoal in the South China Sea. So I picked this because this is directly related to a region that I work in, and it has implications for U.S. foreign policy as we have a treaty alliance with the Philippines. Second Thomas Shoal has become a bit of a flashpoint that really illustrates the complexities of historical claims to territory, their legitimacy, and how they interact with international law and the consensus of the international community. The situation on Second Thomas Shoal and more broadly the South China Sea can really only be described as a jumble of overlapping and conflicting claims. So, just for an orientation, Second Thomas Shoal is located about 120 miles north, or excuse me, 120 miles off the coast of the Philippine island of Palawan. It's located within one of these overlapping regions, so as you can see, it falls within both China's claimed Nine Dash Line and the Philippines' economic exclusive zone under the UN Convention. So, for a brief history, the Spratlys were used as fishing grounds and trade routes for practically all of recorded history. But if we zoom forward to the 20th century, in the post World War II period, China began to more explicitly define its territorial boundaries. And in 1947, the government of China published a map defining the Spratly, Paracel, and Prata Island groups as all being under Chinese sovereignty within what at the time was the 11 Dash Line. The claim was quickly countered by Malaysia and the Philippines and Taiwan, who themselves all claimed parts of these island groups. But in 1986, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, established territorial waters and economic exclusive zones for all coastal nations. By 2009, Vietnam, Malaysia, and the Philippines had all made their claims known to the UN, which included large swaths of the South China Sea and the Spratly Islands. But then China submitted its own claim, which included what we now know as the Nine Dash Line, and it included all of the islands within the South China Sea. There was a tribunal held by the Permanent Court of Arbitration on behalf of the Philippines in 2013 that ruled that the Nine Dash Line was not a legitimate claim and that the EEZs that had been established under UNCLOS were to be the standard for determining resource exploration and exploitation. So if we go to 2011, China begins to do dredging operations to help build up the shoals into permanent islands as a way of asserting its claim within the South China Sea. By 2022, these islands had become built up enough to sustain airfields and ports and semi-permanent populations, and they became consistent outposts for Chinese Navy and Coast Guard as well as Chinese fishing fleets. So if we go to the current situation, the Philippines had deliberately ran the World War II era ship, the BRP Sierra Madre. They ran it aground on the inside of the shoal, and they never decommissioned the ship, which makes it a de facto military outpost on the shoal, kind of like what China had been doing later on. There had been a consistent detachment of Philippine Marines assigned to the ship to maintain it, and since the beaching, the Chinese Coast Guard consistently patrolled the shoal to make sure that they had maintained claim on their island. But to sustain the Marine detachment on board, the Philippine Navy had to send resupply ships consistently with food necessities and fresh personnel. Seeing that China sees the Sierra Madre as an incursion upon its sovereign territory, this greatly raised tensions in the region. And this came to a head in 2023 when China surged the number of Coast Guard vessels to Second Thomas Shoal. In 2024, the Chinese Coast Guard adopted increasingly provocative tactics to try to dissuade the Philippines from resupply missions. They were short of military tactics, but they did include water cannons and ramming and tear gas and even crowd control lasers. As of July 2024, China and the Philippines have reached an agreement that would allow the Philippine resupply ships to continue bringing supplies to the Philippine Marines. And the Chinese Coast Guard is not to interfere with them so long as they remain in their limited missions. So how are we to make sense of this whole situation? Well, if we were to assess the nature of the two nations' claims on Second Thomas Shoal, it largely relies on historical analysis, but also geographical proxemics, since Second Thomas Shoal and all of the South China Sea islands are unpopulated and have no ethnic ties or histories of any kind to speak of. So a lack of a permanent population means that claims of sovereignty can only be legitimate if recognized by other members of the international community, since there's no population within it to give the legitimacy to any country. There are a few complicating factors. While UNCLOS defines the outer limits of the EEZs, the Philippines, Vietnam, and China, they each claim all or some or all of the Spratlys. To make things even more complicated, Taiwan also agrees that the Chinese claim to the Spratly Islands is legitimate. However, it defines itself as the legitimate China, thus confusing the issue of sovereignty even further. Another complicating factor is the fact that the 9-dash line is not strictly defined in either its physical location or its legal function. So this is similar to the Belt and Road Initiative in that China has somewhat benefited from this ambiguity in that it has forestalled the arbitration or an arbitration proceeding that the China will accept. So though the issue of dispute was taken up by the Permanent Court of Arbitration in 2013, China argued that such a tribunal doesn't have jurisdiction over this particular case, and it refused to be present for the proceedings. Now, because it was not present, the PCA ruled in favor of the Philippines, saying that the 9-dash line claims were illegitimate. China then further argued that under provisions of the ASEAN-China Declaration of Conduct for Parties in the South China Sea, such disputation negotiations were only to be resolved through bilateral negotiations, which, notably, they had refused to participate in until 2004 or 2024. So the question is, who has legitimate sovereignty? Well, China may not have recognized sovereignty among the international community. It does exercise de facto sovereignty over the Spratlys and Second Thomas Shoal through use of its naval and coastal security power, in addition to the outposts it has established throughout the island groups. So China argues that it has the longest running sovereignty regime among the nations in question. This is largely due to the fact that many of the nations around the South China Sea were either former colonies or former territories, such as Vietnam vis-a-vis France and the Philippines vis-a-vis the United States. China would argue that the expressions of sovereignty from these nations, from either the Philippines or Vietnam, only took place after China had established the 9-dash line and had secured its sovereignty over the Spratlys. Now, while this is framed as a historical claim, the argument hinges upon there being no historical claims from the other South China Sea nations until the latter half of the 20th century. However, China was not the only people group to use the islands as fishing grounds since time immemorial, as they say. The indigenous people of the present-day Philippines, Malaysia, and Vietnam also use these islands, which means that the historical claim is actually an argument from continuity of nationality. China argues that their nation is the one that has the most historical claim to the present day, or while the present-day Philippine and Vietnamese governments are comparatively recent additions to the international community. And this is an argument that could potentially make sense. However, there is one catch, one more complicating factor, and that is Taiwan. There is an argument to be made, and Taiwan does in fact make it, that the legitimate continuous government of China is the one that's currently cloistered in Taipei, while the government in Beijing is, as they would say, an illegitimate revolutionary regime. So if the PRC China relies on a regime continuity for its historical claim, by its own logic, there is a way that it could be forced to surrender the Spratlys and Second Thomas Shoal to the government of Taiwan, but I doubt that they're going to do that. So what is there to be done to settle who owns Second Thomas Shoal? Well, the sovereignty impasse at Second Thomas Shoal and the Spratlys more broadly is about as messy as it can possibly be. The only way to establish sovereignty would be through international consensus or by military force. The international consensus under UNCLOS agrees with the UNCLOS boundaries of the EEZs that exist about 200 nautical miles off the coast of each nation. However, China has, as we said earlier, de facto authority over these islands insofar as it has the most powerful military in that sea and has established outposts on those islands, and it controls them through force. So, in conclusion, the conflict over the Second Thomas Shoal requires a higher degree of specificity from China and from the UN in order to arbitrate how exactly to divide up these claims within the South China Sea. The perception of China as an expanding power in the region will certainly color these arbitrations. However, since the South China Sea is such an important waterway for trade, it's necessary for these arbitrations to take place to settle and to de-escalate the situation. So I hope you enjoyed, and I appreciate you listening to what I have to say. Thank you.